Close your eyes for a second. Picture the person who raised you. The person whose hands you remember before you remember their face. The hands that packed your lunch, or fixed your collar, or held yours when you crossed the street and the world was loud and you were small. Now imagine those hands are the last thing you ever touched of them. Imagine the weight of that final grip is still inside your palm. 6 years later, so heavy and so sacred that you cannot bring yourself to hold anything else. Not your husband's hand, not your children's hands, not the outstretched hand of a game show host standing in front of 200 strangers who are about to decide you are rude. On a Thursday afternoon in mid-February, a woman stepped onto the Family Feud stage wearing thin white cotton gloves and carrying 6 years of silence wrapped around her right hand. When Steve Harvey reached out to shake it, she stepped back. She did not explain. The audience shifted. The energy changed. And then, 20 minutes later, Steve Harvey saw what was under the glove. He did not shake her hand after that. Either he held it. And he did not let go for a very long time. The taping had been running clean all afternoon. 3 games finished, all on schedule. The crew was in that sweet spot where the rhythm of the day had settled into something automatic. Camera swings, lighting cues, commercial breaks falling like clockwork. Steve had been loose and sharp, landing jokes with the timing of a man who genuinely loved his job and had been doing it long enough that the stage felt like a living room. The 4th game was the Vasquez family from Akron, Ohio, against the Lennox family from Savannah, Georgia standard pairing. 5 members each. No special flags in the production notes. The Lennox family came out first, big energy, matching sweaters, a patriarch who hugged Steve so hard a microphone popped. The audience was already warmed up and laughing before the Vasquez family was even introduced. When the Vasquezes walked out, the temperature shifted. Not because they were cold, they were warm. Marco Vasquez, 46, a machinist with a quiet smile, led the line. Their daughter Sophia, 14, confident and bright. Their son Mateo, 10, bouncing with the unchecked excitement of a child who cannot believe he is on television. Marco's sister Elena, 39, at the far end. And in the center of the line, Hannah Vasquez, 44 years old. Medium build, dark hair pulled into a low twist. She wore a cream-colored blouse with sleeves that ended precisely at her wrists, and on both hands thin white cotton gloves, the kind you might see in a museum or a darkroom. Clean, worn soft, almost translucent at the fingertips from years of washing. Steve worked his way down the line. Handshakes, names, jokes. He reached Hannah. He extended his hand. The gesture was automatic. The same hand he had extended 10,000 times across 20 years of television. Hannah did not take it. She stepped back. Not far. Half a step. Just enough that Steve's hand hung in the air for a beat longer than it should have, and the audience noticed. A murmur moved through the rows, the sound people make when they are not sure what they have just witnessed. Something between confusion and mild discomfort. The camera operator on stage left adjusted his frame slightly, instinctively centering on the gap between Steve's hand and the woman who had declined it. Steve recovered instantly. He was too experienced to let a moment like that land wrong. He smiled, dipped his head, and said, "All right, we'll skip the formalities. What's your name?" "Hannah," she said. Her voice was steady, warm, even. She was not hostile. She was not performing. She simply had not taken his hand, and she offered no explanation. "Hannah, good to have you here." Steve moved on. The taping continued. The moment passed. But it had been noticed. The audience had catalogued it. A few people in the front rows glanced at each other. A woman in the second row whispered something to her husband. The unspoken consensus formed the way it always does. Quickly, silently, and almost certainly wrong, she was difficult. She was germophobic. She was making a statement. She was rude. Nobody considered the gloves. Nobody wondered why a woman would wear thin white cotton gloves on a game show stage in February and keep her hands at her sides like they were carrying something fragile and invisible and unbearable. Nobody, that is, except Marco. He was watching his wife from the far end of the podium with an expression that did not belong on the face of a man playing a game show. It was the expression of someone who had watched the person he loved walk into a room full of strangers and brace for the judgment that always followed, and who had never, not once in 6 years, been able to protect her from it. Hannah Vasquez had not shaken anyone's hand in 6 years, 2 months, and 14 days. Not a colleague. Not a neighbor. Not her children's teachers at parent conferences, where she kept her gloved hands folded on the table and smiled through the puzzled looks. Not her husband, who had learned to express love through a palm resting on a shoulder or a forehead pressed against hers, because her hands were no longer something she could share. The gloves were not a preference. They were not a quirk. They were a bandage, not for a wound that was healing, but for a wound she had chosen to carry in private, sealed beneath white cotton, touched by no one. What was under the gloves was a story that Hannah had told exactly 3 people in 6 years: Marco, her therapist, and a surgeon who had looked at her hands under fluorescent light and spoken the word permanent in a voice carefully stripped of emotion. Under the left glove, scar tissue from the base of her fingers to the middle of her forearm. Pink, ridged, smooth in places, and rough in others. The skin grafts had taken, but the nerves had not fully reconnected, leaving patches of numbness alternating with patches of searing sensitivity. A topography of pain that shifted with temperature, with pressure, with weather. Under the right glove, the same scarring, but worse. 2 fingers that no longer fully closed. And wrapped around her palm, threaded between those damaged fingers, a thin silver chain holding a small gold ring, her mother's wedding ring. The ring had been on her mother's finger the last time Hannah held her hand, and it had stayed there, through the fire, through the ambulance, through the emergency room, until a nurse at Akron General placed it in a clear plastic bag and handed it to Hannah 9 hours later with a sentence that began with the words, "I'm sorry." The fire happened on a Saturday evening in December 6 years before the taping. Hannah and Marco and the children had gone to her mother's house for dinner, a weekly tradition, the same house in Akron where Hannah had grown up, the same kitchen where her mother, Dolores, had cooked for 40 years. Dolores Reyes was 71. A retired school lunch aide. A woman whose entire identity was organized around feeding people, her children, her neighbors, the stray cats that gathered on her back porch every morning for the dishes of tuna she set out before sunrise. That evening, Dolores was making tamales. She had been making tamales since before Hannah was born, and she did it the same way every time, masa spread on corn husks at the kitchen counter. Pork filling in the cast iron skillet on the back burner, the oven preheating for the final steam. Marco was in the living room with the kids watching a basketball game. Hannah was at the kitchen table folding husks, listening to her mother talk about a neighbor's new dog. The skillet ignited. Grease fire. The back burner had been running too high. The flame caught the oil in the skillet, leapt to the paper towels on the counter, and within seconds the wall behind the stove was burning. Marco got the children out the front door in under 30 seconds. He came back for Hannah and Dolores, but the kitchen was already impassable from the living room, the fire had reached the curtains, and the door frame was engulfed. Hannah did not leave. She grabbed her mother's arm. Dolores was disoriented, the smoke was already thick, the heat already savage, and she had frozen in place beside the counter, her hands still holding a corn husk, her body locked in the particular paralysis that overtakes a person when the space they know better than any space on earth is suddenly trying to kill them. Hannah pulled her toward the back door. Dolores could not move fast enough. The ceiling above the stove collapsed. A section of burning drywall fell across Hannah's arms and hands as she was reaching for the door handle. She did not let go of her mother. She held Dolores's hand, gripped it, her left hand locked around her mother's right, and dragged her through the back door and into the yard, and she held on until the paramedics arrived. And she held on in the ambulance, and she held on in the emergency room until a doctor told her she needed to let go so they could treat the burns on both of them. Dolores Reyes died 7 hours later from smoke inhalation and cardiac arrest. She was 71 years old. Hannah's hands were treated. The burns were 3rd degree across 60% of both hands. The surgeries took 4 months. The skin grafts took. The feeling did not fully return. The ring came back in a plastic bag. Hannah wrapped the chain around her right palm the day after the funeral. She threaded it between her 2nd and 3rd fingers, the 2 that still closed, and looped it once around her wrist. Then she put on a pair of white cotton gloves and did not take them off in public again. The gloves became part of her the way a cast becomes part of a broken limb, a visible marker of something invisible. People asked. She answered vaguely. She said she had a skin condition. She said she was sensitive to cold. She said whatever was easiest in the moment, and people accepted it, and she moved on. But she did not shake hands. She could not. The act of opening her grip, of extending her scarred fingers and letting another person's hand close around them, meant letting go of the chain. And the chain was connected to the ring. And the ring was the last physical object that had touched her mother's skin while her mother was alive. To shake someone's hand, Hannah would have to release the one handhold she had left. She had tried once. 8 months after the fire, at a parent-teacher conference, Sophia's English teacher had reached across the desk and taken Hannah's gloved hand before Hannah could pull back. The woman's fingers closed around the glove and pressed against the chain underneath, and Hannah felt the ring shift, just a millimeter, a tiny movement against her scarred palm. And her body reacted before her mind could intervene. She pulled her hand away so hard she knocked a coffee cup off the desk. She apologized. The teacher looked at her strangely. Hannah drove home with both hands locked on the steering wheel and cried in the driveway for 20 minutes. She never tried again. Marco understood. He had been there the night of the fire. He had watched his wife stagger out of a burning kitchen holding her mother with hands that were already blistering, and he had stood in a hospital hallway at 3 a.m. while a surgeon explained that the damage to the tendons in her right hand was permanent, and he had brought her home 4 months later and watched her wrap a dead woman's ring around her palm and seal it under cotton. And never speak about it again. He did not ask her to let go. He did not tell her it was time. He loved her in the spaces she could still give, a shoulder pressed against hers on the couch, a forehead touching hers in bed, a voice that said good morning in the dark before either of them opened their eyes. The children understood in the way children understand things they cannot name. Sophia, who had been 8 when the fire happened, remembered the feeling of her mother's hand gripping hers in the ambulance, the grip already weakening, the skin already wrong. She had not tried to hold her mother's hand since. Mateo, who had been 4 and remembered almost nothing, only knew that Mama wore gloves and that this was not something you asked about. The feud application was Elena's idea, a birthday present for Marco. Hannah agreed because the family wanted it, and because she had spent 6 years organizing her life around avoidance. And she was tired, not tired of the grief, not tired of the ring, but tired of the way strangers looked at her when she would not shake their hand, as though the refusal said something about her character instead of something about her loss. She wore the gloves to the taping. She kept her hands at her sides, and when Steve Harvey extended his hand, she stepped back. Because the alternative was explaining in front of 200 people why a simple handshake was the one thing she could not give. The Vasquezes played well. Marco was steady on the buzzer. Sofia was quick. Mateo got one question spectacularly wrong. He answered an elephant to name something you'd find in a kitchen drawer, and the audience loved him for it. Steve nearly fell over laughing. Even Hannah smiled, and her smile was the kind of thing that changed a room because it was so clearly rare and so clearly real. They won the main game. They moved to fast money. Elena played first and scored 131, solid, not dominant. Hannah would play second. She stepped up to the fast money podium. She placed both gloved hands on the surface. Steve stood across from her with the cards in his hand. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she said. The first 3 questions came fast. Hannah answered each one cleanly, short, precise, delivered with the focused calm of a woman who had spent 6 years controlling exactly what she revealed to the world and had become very good at it. On the 4th question, she reached forward to press the buzzer. The right glove caught on the edge of the podium. The fabric, washed hundreds of times, thinned to near transparency, tore along the seam between her thumb and forefinger. A small tear. An inch, maybe less. But enough. The scarred skin of her right hand was visible through the gap, pink and ridged and unmistakable, and coiled between her fingers, catching the studio light in a single brief flash, the thin silver chain. Hannah froze. Her eyes dropped to her hand. She pulled it back and pressed it against her stomach, covering the tear with her left hand. The motion was fast, instinctive, the reflex of someone who has spent 6 years making sure this exact thing never happened. But Steve had seen it. He had been standing 3 feet away, directly across the podium, and his eyes had been on her hands, not because he was looking for something, but because a good host watches the contestant during fast money. Watches their hands and their face and their breathing for signs of panic or hesitation. He saw the scar. He saw the chain. He saw the way she pulled her hand back like it had been burned again. The buzzer sounded. The question went unanswered. Hannah stood with her right hand pressed against her body and her left hand covering it, and her eyes locked on the podium surface. And for the first time all afternoon, she did not look steady. She looked like a woman standing at the edge of a wall she had built with great care over many years, watching a crack appear. Steve set his cards down. "Hannah," he said quietly, "we don't have to keep going." Hannah looked up at him. Her eyes were full, but her jaw was set. The posture of someone deciding, in real time, whether to repair the wall or let it fall. "I want to tell you why I didn't shake your hand," she said. Steve nodded. "Only if you want to." "I want to." She lowered her left hand. She held up her right. The torn glove hung open at the seam, and through it, under the studio lights, in front of 200 strangers and 4 cameras, and the family she had been protecting from this moment for 6 years. The damage was visible. The scar tissue, the 2 fingers that did not fully close, and threaded between them, coiled tight against her palm, the silver chain with the small gold ring resting at its center. 6 years ago, there was a fire at my mother's house, Hannah said. I pulled my mother out through the back door. My hands were burned. She died that night at the hospital. She turned her palm slightly so the ring caught the light. This was her wedding ring. It was on her hand when I was holding her. After she died, the hospital gave it to me in a plastic bag. I put it in my hand the next day, and I have not taken it out since. Her voice did not crack. It did not waver. It was the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this in her head 10,000 times, in the shower, in the car, in the dark hours before dawn, and had never once said it aloud in front of anyone who was not paid to listen. I don't shake hands, because if I open my grip, the chain moves. And if the chain moves, I feel like I'm letting go of her. I know that doesn't make sense. I know she's gone, and a ring is just a ring. But my hand was the last thing that touched her while she was alive, and this ring was touching her when it happened, and I cannot make my hand release it." She looked at Steve. "I wasn't being rude to you. I would have shaken your hand if I could. But I can't let go." Not yet. The room was silent in the way that only a room full of people who are all feeling the same thing at the same time can be silent. Not empty, but dense. Heavy with the weight of 200 people holding their breath. Steve Harvey did not respond with words. He walked around the podium. He stood in front of Hannah. And he reached down, slowly, carefully, telegraphing every movement so she could pull away if she needed to, and he placed both of his hands around hers. Not a handshake, not a grip. A hold. His massive hands closing gently around her scarred fingers and the chain and the ring, enclosing all of it, the damage and the love and the 6 years of silence, inside his palms. He did not squeeze. He did not pull. He just held. Hannah's breath caught. A single sharp inhale. And then something in her posture changed. A release. A softening. The way a body changes when a weight it has been carrying for so long it forgot the weight, was there is suddenly shared by another pair of hands. She did not let go of the ring. She did not need to. Steve was not asking her to let go. He was telling her she did not have to carry it alone. Marco was standing at the edge of the stage with both hands over his face. Sophia had turned into Elena's shoulder. Matteo stood perfectly still, watching his mother with wide, serious eyes, understanding for the first time why Mama wore gloves. They stood like that for a long time. Long enough for the floor manager to look at the producer, and the producer to look at the clock and the clock to stop mattering. When Steve finally spoke, his voice was low and rough and stripped of every layer of performance. "Hannah, I need you to hear me. You are not rude. You are not difficult. You are not broken." He paused. "You are a woman who ran into a fire and pulled her mother out with her bare hands and has been holding on to her ever since. That is not a flaw. That is the deepest kind of love I have ever seen." He looked at her scarred hand, still enclosed in his. "And this ring, you don't ever have to let go of this ring. Not for me. Not for a handshake. Not for anyone. You hold it as long as you need to hold it. And anyone who doesn't understand that has never loved somebody the way you loved your mother." Hannah was crying. Not the way people cry on television, not dramatic, not performative. She was crying the way people cry when a door they nailed shut 6 years ago has been opened from the outside by someone they did not expect. And the air rushing through it is unbearable and necessary at the same time. Steve turned to the audience. "I want every person in this room to remember something. When someone won't shake your hand, when someone pulls back, or turns away, or does something you don't understand, you do not know what they're carrying. You do not know what's under the glove. You do not know whose ring is wrapped around their hand." He looked back at Hannah. This woman saved her daughter's life and lost her mother on the same night. She burned her hands pulling someone she loved out of a fire. And she has spent 6 years wearing gloves and avoiding handshakes and absorbing the judgment of every stranger who decided she was cold. Because it was easier to let people think she was rude than to explain why her hands will never let go. He let go of her hands. Gently, the way you set something down when you want it to land soft. "Hannah, you are the bravest person who has ever stood on this stage. And I mean that." The audience stood, not in a wave, not in sections. All at once, every row, every seat, every person in that room rising to their feet for a woman in white gloves who had walked onto a game show stage expecting to be misunderstood and had instead been seen. Marco reached the stage in 3 strides. He did not try to take her hand. He stood behind her and wrapped his arms around her shoulders and pressed his forehead against the back of her head and held her the way he had learned to hold her, around the grief, not through it. Sophia crossed next, then Elena. Then Matteo, who walked up to his mother, looked at her gloved hand and very carefully placed his small palm against the outside of the glove, not holding it, not gripping it, just resting against it, the way you rest your hand on a closed door when you know someone you love is on the other side. The fast money round was replayed after a 15-minute break. Hannah insisted. She played the final question with a torn glove and scored high enough to push the combined total past the line. The Vasquez family won $18,500. Hannah pressed the buzzer with the same scarred hand and did not flinch. The episode aired in March. The clip, Steve holding Hannah's hand through the torn glove, was viewed over 12 million times in its first week. It was shared by burn survivor communities, grief support groups, and a startling number of people who posted it with no caption at all, because some things do not need a caption. Hannah did not become public. She did not give interviews or launch a social media account or write an essay about what happened. She went home to Akron. She returned to her job as a billing coordinator at a medical supply company. She wore her gloves. She kept her routine. But two things changed. 3 weeks after the taping, Sophia asked her mother if she could see the ring. Hannah sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she drank her morning coffee, the same kind of table where Dolores had folded corn husks and talked about a neighbor's dog, and she opened her right hand and let her daughter look at the small gold band on the silver chain. Sophia did not touch it. She just looked. And then she said, "Abuela would be so proud of you, Mama," and Hannah closed her fingers around the ring again and nodded, and that was enough. The second thing happened 6 months after the episode aired. On a Sunday morning in September, Hannah walked into the kitchen and found Matteo at the table eating cereal. He looked up at her and held out his hand, not for a handshake, not for a high five, just an open palm, offered upward. The way a child offers something when they want you to know it is safe. Hannah looked at his hand for a long time. Then she placed her gloved hand on top of it. Not a grip, not a hold, a rest. Her cotton-covered fingers settling against his small, unmarked palm, the ring pressing faintly through the fabric. It was the first time she had voluntarily touched another person's hand in 6 years. Matteo went back to his cereal. Hannah stood at the table with her hand on his and her eyes on the window and the morning light coming through. Some hands hold rings, some hands hold scars, some hands hold both, and the person wearing the gloves is not cold. She is carrying the heaviest kind of love there is, the kind that would not let go even when the fire said she had to. If this one stayed with you longer than you expected, you are in the right place. Stay close. There are more stories here that deserve hands willing to hold them.